kick us off. So excited to chat with you. Obviously, we had a little bit of time to talk about this presentation and kind of what we wanted to go through last week. And I've been excited ever since that conversation to really go deep into some of the topics that we had addressed. So real quick, just by way of introduction, I want to make sure that we introduce you and kind of what we're doing here. So Laura, you are, well, actually, you know what? You're here. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay. I'm a brand strategist and marketing lead and have worked with a number of startups as they think about expanding their business into new markets specifically, and then have also led regional teams, mostly in Europe. And more recently, I was at Magnum Photos, which is an iconic photography agency, helping them develop their consumer business and their e-commerce global site and experience. And now I'm an independent consultant and I get to work with lots of different brands, some who are actually coming into the US for the first time, and then a lot who are thinking about internationalizing from the US, and often starting with Commonwealth countries and then into Europe.
Awesome. And just the connection between you and Blue Onion, you had the chance to work with our CEO, Lindsay, back in the day at Birchbox. And I'll just mention, I don't know if you mentioned this, but you also worked at obviously one of the big successful D2C companies, Away Luggage. And so tons of experience that you bring to the table here. I, by way of introduction, Mike Raubach, I run sales here at Blue Onion and business development. And so it's awesome for me to get to talk to people who have tons of experience in this space and have lots of great ideas and insights to share that can potentially help all the companies that we work with continue to be more sophisticated in their approach. So I think that the conversation that we wanted to have today is really just kind of an open-ended conversation about what's it look like for a brand that's scaling to start to think about how to get into new markets, and what do you need to have in place as a company to make that happen? What do you need to have in place in terms of process? What's a product look like that needs to scale? And I can't think of anyone better to have that conversation with than you because of your experience. And so we had talked a little bit about just kind of what's a good kind of process to think through as you're starting to, kind of work through those first initial thoughts that are coming into your head when you're laying awake at night. Is it time for my brand to expand? So maybe I'll just kind of start the conversation off and take the other side of the table and, say, hey, I am a D2C brand. We went viral last year. We had some success. We've got a really cool product, and now we're thinking like, let's go big, right? Maybe we just went out and got a little bit of money from some VCs or equity partners. It's time for us to go and really start to think about scaling this thing. But at the same time, obviously, elephant in the room is, a lot of uncertainty in the market right now. And so goes without saying, we're seeing, inflation, prices are changing. There's a lot of kind of dynamics, macro and micro, that are impacting supply chains on one side, and then kind of the decision-making, consumer behavior on the other side. And so a lot to take into consideration here before making a big leap like entering a new market. So I think maybe the first question I would have for you is, how do I know if my product is ready? How do I know if my product is set up for success, ready for it to go and enter a new market?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the product itself. So if you think about the category, are there restrictions to entry? If you think about a beauty product into Canada, Europe, Australia, they often have much higher health codes that you actually have to go through and hoops that you have to jump through. A more stable product like a luggage product or a tangible good, maybe you don't need to think about those things because they're quite common throughout the market. But you might want to think about what the expectation is around sustainability and how your product is built. Or if you're talking about it like an electronic, can you actually plug it into the wall? So there might be some really basic, does this product work or function in this market, or do I have to rethink it entirely? You would have to imagine your product packaging at some point, but
Yeah.
that might be able to be left for later. So initially, even before that, can this product exist in the market, or do I need to take additional steps?
Maybe even taking a step back further, what do I need to think about in terms of like IP protection?
Yes. So that is when you would want to think about, does the brand name exist in the market? Do you have patents that have been global, or are they only in the US or existing markets? That is often something you would talk about with general counsel or external leadership, like legal support. But it is something to explore, so that when you enter a market, do you have to actually change the brand name to exist well, and maybe even look at what other similar brand names exist or within the category, so that you create differentiation. I guess it depends on if you are a more brand-led or product-led kind of company. So if you're more brand-led, brand name is going to be incredibly important, and not being confused for another company will be really important, and keeping that consistency and that global experience. If you're really about the product, maybe it's less important. And that's sort of some of the decision making that you'll have to make before you even enter. And I would say, even as part of that product consideration, you were talking about sort of the macro expectations. And I think beyond can the product enter, it's also how much risk does this business feel it can take on at this point, as a total organism. It meaning, if it's hard to raise money and we have X amount of runway and we have decent product market fit, but we're not very secure in our home market, is this really the right time to enter a new market? Or is it a requirement actually to get to the next level of business, be that, exiting to an IPO or some other stage where you really feel it's a requirement to enter new markets to be able to be a viable business partner?
Yeah. And maybe that's an interesting train of thought to follow here, which is it worth me investing? And maybe how do you advise companies thinking about, hey, maybe you should start to think about differentiating your product and creating, additional SKUs or variants of your product in your home market before going and saying, I'm just going to take this thing that I've got that's been successful and try to, ride it out here in the UK or something. How do you think about and advise companies when you're talking about, hey, you need to grow, every company needs to grow, but maybe the lower hanging fruit, the easier path to growth exists in your home market with a little bit different product strategy than just, maybe saying, I just need to go and kind of grow the number of customers I can address by going into a new market?
It's quite rarely an or situation. It's usually an and situation, which actually makes it more challenging, because you're riding this growth wave in your home market. You're maybe adding SKUs, new product ideas, new types of offerings, and you're thinking about, how do I grow into new markets? And that's sort of when you get more into the process, people, and setup of the organization, where if you do not have solid processes, or you're still trying to understand the organizational dynamic and how we want to operate internally, because you're growing so fast in your home market, you haven't had time to really think about those operations and strategic questions internally. Maybe that's actually a great impetus to begin that process, so that you feel ready to then not only expand your product offering, but also go into new markets. Because I think that's something that's quite often underestimated, even when thinking about a quote unquote easy like market, as in a Canada, where often mistakenly businesses think of it as a 51st market, 51st state. For some roles, it will double workload. For others, it will be more incremental. But identifying which of those roles are going to be vastly impacted versus others, and then how do you want to organize yourself internally? Do you start to think about global campaigns with individual market visions and products underneath? And beyond that, how do you create a voice of the consumer in the home market when your international markets are not only always going to be smaller initially, but also be starting from scratch, and you have to re-educate that consumer from day zero rather than 5 years into your journey in the US market.
Right. Is there a product or a category that's like a no-brainer?
What do you mean?
You should take to a new market?
I think some types of products are more intrinsically global because of how people behave. So in my experience, when I met the founders of Away, for me, it was like people travel globally. That's how people operate. And therefore,
Luggage, yeah, any airport you go through, you see
you see
roughly
luggage.
luggage. It's not like there's a totally different kind of luggage in, the
Yeah.
Amsterdam.
And the way people move is globally. And so therefore, by definition, it is a global company.
Yeah.
And then there's also a discovery factor. Maybe actually it's really interesting to move into a new market because you are inherently American or inherently British. I was just talking to a tableware company where the aesthetic is incredibly British looking.
Yeah.
And you would recognize it as such. And therefore, in the US, they are going to lean into that as part of their storytelling and value that as part of their product offering. And it does move internationally because in the UK, you can really find this product not inherently everywhere, but it is much more common in the total aesthetic versus the US.
Are there particular categories where that's the case? I mean, I guess I would imagine. I lived in the UK for several years, and the thing that always was like seemed that there was a lot of kind of consumer curiosity about in the UK was stuff like athletic apparel, right? The kids and the teenagers in the UK wanted, they followed LeBron James and they wanted to wear the same kind of shoes, and so you had this kind of connection because of like the global nature of American sports, things like that. Are there kind of crossover categories where you see like, yeah, these consumers, because it does seem that like the reverse would be the case. Like I'm sure if a British tableware company it's like there just seems to be that natural kind of assumption. It's like, well, it's got to be like premium, right? Because it's British.
Right.
They so sound it seems like you could easily sort of like translate that, but do you see that being the case in particular categories?
I have seen, if you're thinking like B2C consumer brands specifically, those that have created cultural cachet in America often translate well because there is a sort of interest in what the American culture dynamic landscape is producing. And if you can tap into that in the US, there will be customers in Commonwealth countries primarily initially, and then broader markets who are very aware of those like cultural moments and how brands are building them and sort of that cultural zeitgeist that they're driving. But that's not necessarily product driven. It's the approach of the brand itself.
Yeah, it's more about how you've kind of positioned yourself in the market, and who are you able to get to endorse your products and
exactly, and like the partnerships that you can create in your home market, and who is your ambassador or spokespeople. On the B2B side, I'm frankly less familiar, but I could imagine that certain areas or industries which are slightly less developed in other markets might have a great stronghold. Because for example, in the US, there's just so much ability to be entrepreneurial and start up new business arenas. Maybe that's less common in certain other markets because it's just less practiced. And so you could be the first into an area that's burgeoning in need, but not actually developed, and be the first one there and take all the business in the future business.
Yeah. So maybe it's sort of something like in terms of knowing your market and, thinking externally, right? So we've kind of been talking like the focus on how do I think about like how the market views me, my company, my product, whatever. And, thinking in terms your real practical, it's like, hey, look, if you're selling a luxury product in the US to US consumers, it might be harder to go and take, if you're selling luxury jeans with a, Southern California aesthetic to people in the Southwest and everybody loves it, that might not translate perfectly to the European market. But on the flip side, maybe it does, right? Maybe you captured a cultural zeitgeist, and you've got Gwyneth Paltrow or something. It was wearing your jeans, and people in other markets see that and they're like, yeah, that's like that California cool style, and we want to capture that. We want access to that, whether we're in Italy or in the UK or wherever, right?
Exactly. And then I guess the other side of that is if, as an American-based brand, you're trying to capture an aesthetic or cultural element from another market, it might be difficult to enter that same
To go
market.
backwards to that market and be like, oh yeah, like we're sort of
Yeah.
mirroring that kind of like Georgian British style, and we're a Northeast silverware company. Now we're going to go and try and sell it in London. People are like, well, this is just a copy of what we have here. Like, I don't know.
Exactly. Like, we originated this. Why are you coming back to us?
Sure.
So something to just consider if you have a very particular and dedicated style and niche or positioning.
Yeah, maybe one other question on kind of this outward kind of focus of just looking at markets. Do you see a difference? Because I think the natural tendency probably for a brand in the United States is probably to think Commonwealth countries, right? No language barrier,
Very common.
Similar kind of tax laws and legal structures and frameworks and things like that.
At least we all speak English.
At least we all speak English. You can read the service agreements at least. But have you noticed, having worked in obviously the difference, are there any obvious kind of things that you've noticed where you say, hey, like there's a big difference when you're talking about the continental kind of EU market versus, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, whatever?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the most common practice I've seen is that you enter into Canada because there's from like an ops perspective, just getting product over the border is closer, it's easier in that respect. And then a lot of companies treat it as if it's the 51st state. Yeah. And Canadians know that. They don't enjoy that and usually react quite quickly. And also there's market difference if you're thinking about e-commerce versus retail, insofar as the US is often a leader in e-commerce practices. And so the Canadian consumer, despite the fact that they're majority in either like big cities, Toronto's, Vancouver's, Calgary's, with vast spaces in between where it would be ideal for e-commerce, they really love a retail store. Yeah. So it might really depend on your go-to-market strategy, how your consumer in each of these markets behaves within their own ecosystem already. Yeah. As well as the fact that you are starting from scratch. Coming in and being like, us already is not a great strategy to win friends and get favors. And doing a light bit of consumer insights work. I mean, honestly, normally at the point that you're considering a true launch into these markets, you will have had some indication of interest from those markets, be it web traffic, people writing into customer service being like, do you sell here? Can you ship here? Reach out to those people. How did you hear about us? What do you think about the product that we're selling? What are the other brands that you're looking at? I mean, it can be quite lightweight and you can get a lot of early indicators of big missteps not to take. Yeah. And then you start to get into the details of each market and you think about, for example, in the UK, London is, of course, the hub of most commercial behavior and majority of a significant population draw, unlike the US where there's maybe 50 Londons. Right. How do you leverage that sort of like epicenter and also think about how their consumer behavior might differ, often a little bit longer on consideration period worth it to build that in. They have a different pay schedule. They're only paid once a month versus twice a month. How does that change your month-long projection? They don't have things like Thanksgiving. So that actually moves their Christmas period up earlier in the year into October. And if you walk around in October 1st, suddenly you're starting to see Christmas decorations. We would not see that in the States. All of those things play into how you start to approach your planning and your actual entry into the market.
Interesting. And that's maybe a good point to just mention that this is exactly the kind of strategy and planning that you do and obviously other firms. And that's where, I think that the advice that any of us would give is go talk to people who have done it before as well and get that insight from them. Don't learn all the lessons the hard way yourself and save yourself a bunch of mistakes and heartache along the way. and set yourself up for success.
Yeah, and there's ways to dip your toe into the water. If you're open to maybe not taking the full plunge, can you open shipping, either with a shipping cost or you eat that cost, to just test how you interact and what the consumer is interested in and what they're really gravitating towards, and just build some of your brand awareness organically.
Yeah.
You can also, there is a world of other companies that have done this, and they all have internal teams, either individuals who are driving the strategy and operations, or market specific in-market experts. And there are mini communities that are built between those partners, because often, especially when you're not competing on product, you want to help each other. You want to be like, hey, I saw this thing. What did you learn? Blah, blah, blah. Who do you talk to about that process? Try to hook into those communities, and even just reach out on LinkedIn or find someone who can hook you in, because they're a wealth of information.
Awesome. All right. So Laura, I've decided, you've convinced me that I need to go and enter a new market, right? So I've looked at my product. I feel like I've got a great strategy. I've got, interest in the market, dipped my toe in, people have made some purchases, and I'm starting to feel things out. I guess maybe though, the next question I've got is turning my gaze from outside at the markets internally towards my own company. How do I know if my business is set up for success?
So there are technical and operational pieces, there are people pieces, and then there's probably like brand and marketing and communication elements. If you start on the foundational side, what does your sort of technical process, how does it operate?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a tech stack that is able to be internationalized? Are you actually reimagining your whole back end, in which case you should build one that is able to be in international markets or multiple markets at the same time? Or are you really not comfortable doing that yet, and you want to build a little MVP and see how that turns out?
And in this, you mean, when you say tech stack, you mean like, does my ad software, am I able to run ads and use it in the market that I want to enter? Is, my support, chat service, does it function properly in that market, right? Like, I mean, you mean quite literally down to the bare metal of like, does your website load up in that market, right?
Exactly. So like, I would even start before you get into the ad side of it, like, does my website work in this market?
Yeah.
Can it hold multiple currencies? Can it, depending on what kind of thing you have on your site, does it operate? Like, does it have to be translated into a language and it actually can't do those things? And understanding like, okay, I'm going to start with these markets. Do I believe them to fully be successful, and I actually want to start investing in an internationalization of that platform early? Or do I need to wait, see how they go, and then reassess in X amount of time when we've seen this kind of progress or success in those markets?
Mm-hmm.
So it's very like bare bones technical.
Yeah. And then in terms of people, I think that's probably the one that's the most sort of right. It's like easy to technically test, like, okay, does my website load up, right? Does the 3D like spinning, suitcase show up on the, in the UK market, or do I need to like update my Java or whatever, right? Like, does all of that work? But like, I think the people piece is probably the one that's more nebulous. It's harder to kind of put your finger on, right? What's it look like to have a team that's ready to go into a new market?
Some of it is about how is this project rated against other projects? Is this the most important thing that you're going to be doing in the year? Is this the 5th most important thing that you're going to be doing in the year? And then how does the team feel about that prioritization? And are they able to respond to it? So, some leaders may have never gone into new markets, and it might feel really exciting or really daunting.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a whole emotional component to this. And then also, how is your organization designed? Are you siloed, more matrixed? How are decisions made? And how will that change or evolve as you have multiple markets? What tends to happen is that there is an initial period where everything is really done through HQ. You have very minor on the ground, boots on the ground support. Then you differentiate into having a regional support. that is struggling to get what they feel like they need in order to be successful in that market because it is such a tiny market. And then you go into a globalization process where at the leadership level, everyone is thinking globally, and then there's regional support at every level.
Yeah. And in
that is like the whole life cycle, I guess.
That's the full process. In your experience at a few of the places that you've worked, I mean, what were some of the missteps? What were the things that you realized, like, oh no, like we probably should have had this person in place before we started this, and now we're wearing a bunch of multiple hats simultaneously trying to hire the perfect person for this job in a market that's totally new for us?
Yeah, so when I was at Birchbox, I led the expansion into Canada, and then it was sort of imagined that it would be 5% of every person's time in the US market. And what we saw was incredible first 2-3 month results, blew our expectations away. Mm-hmm. And then a significant drop, not only in new subscriptions and churn, but also NPS. And we were like, okay, what happened? What really happened is that when it's 5% of everyone's job, it's no one's job. And right. So it became evident that there were certain particularly customer-facing roles, merchandising, certain marketing, social media, PR, where you needed to have some amount of focus, be it half of your time or a full-time person. And that could be validated against the subscription growth that we were seeing.
So it was really like, oh, everyone's super excited about it. So we're really all putting in like 99% of our time. We're going to make this happen. It launched. Everyone was like, okay.
Well, yeah, because you go back to life as usual.
It's good to go. And then at that point, it just kind of, hit the wall.
And even if you were to think like, okay, the US market compared to the Canadian market, 10%, you're not going to get that tomorrow. And you're starting many years behind where you currently are in your US mm-hmm. market. So you're already teeny tiny.
Right.
So every time somebody makes an individual decision about where am I going to put my time and priority, it's always going to be the home market. And so it ends up that in order for the other markets to be successful, it feels as if you have to overinvest in resourcing there.
Yeah. And that's where kind of maybe to your previous point of like, what are you telling people is their top priority? And if you're telling your ad team, hey, we need to grow 100% in the US market this year from where we were last year. Also we're launching in, a new market, and we need to experience, we expect 10 or 15% of our sales to come from here too. All of a sudden they're having to decide like, hey, what's the path of least resistance for us to hit these numbers that we're being told to hit? And, where are we going to devote our time and our spend to achieve that? And so you got to kind of align all of those incentives and make sure that everybody's kind of pacing at in the same direction.
And each individual person in their decision making makes sense. It's just on aggregate, it becomes problematic.
Right. Everybody makes a good decision about how they spend their time for their job.
And then the other thing that you start to get into is, frankly, like the logistics of, if you have an Australian market, the time difference between Australia, let's say Sydney, and New York, you are always going to be on the phone at 8 p.m. or 7 in the morning. And the working hours, the sort of operations, are almost impossible without having somebody actually on the ground and somewhat, positioned to make decisions because of the logistics of time.
Right.
And then the second other logistics element of people is expertise in the market. And the reason I say that is, if you imagine that paid social person who's like making a campaign, and they don't really realize that like using this one word in a certain way in the UK market means something different than it means in the US market, they're not to blame, but it might fall completely flat.
Yeah.
So for example, we saw at Away in our UK business, we had a great team who were buying TV in the US, based in California. And we were like, can we test into the UK market? We have this awesome campaign. We want to run it. They started to buy day parts, and we were like, wow, CPA is just awful. What is going on? And we started to look at it, and it was like, oh, you've bought on very odd channels at the wrong times, and you don't actually know how the day parts work because it's a completely different system. And so that requires maybe local expertise. And we went into a local agency, and they rebought and restructured the entire thing. And it had on par, if not better, to expectations. So understanding which of those critical sort of market specific roles need local expertise.
Yeah, I think that's a good piece of advice, generally speaking, which is once you've been successful, you start to develop this sense of confidence, which is a good thing, right? You start to get this, we can go do this, right? We're going to go and we're going to break into a new market. We're going to launch a new product. And that's what you need, is that entrepreneurial spirit and belief in yourself. But at the same time, to temper that with the, understanding of what do we know and what do we not know, and being realistic about, we just don't know, and we should probably go talk to someone and get a piece of advice here, or talk to somebody on the ground who's done this before, so that we can start to better understand what our blind spots are and not make those kinds of missteps that end up costing real dollars, right?
Yeah, and I think what's challenging about that is some things you can copy and paste and some things you can't, and you don't always know until it's done.
Yeah. Maybe the another question that's more broad to kind of setting a company up for success in these markets is, what have you seen in terms of backing? What's it look like? What's a company need to have in terms of either like runway, what are they needing to have in place from a cash flow perspective? What do they need to have in place in terms of maybe equity or PE backing that's enabling them to kind of go and make these big kind of pushes into these new markets? Is there a particular kind of setup that you've seen that companies typically have, or is it just, whoever is ready to kind of make that move and feels like they want to take on the risk?
It depends. So certainly if your home market is unstable and you feel at risk in your financial position, I would never recommend that you move internationally, because it is expensive. It's more expensive than you're ever going to, than you think. It's more expensive than you budget, essentially. That being said, there are ways to do it if you think about the go-to-market that can temper those costs. Maybe even if you are a D2C brand, you would consider actually a retail partnership as your first way in, and not only leveraging the credibility of that business, but also frankly getting cash up front for a new market, see what sells, see how things go, and then you can make more thoughtful decisions about how you invest in those markets. Magnum, for example, was always inherently a global business, but actually not organized as such. It was set up as bureaus instead of a business. And so it was actually imagining resetting that structure and allowing the globalness that already existed to come through in all facets. And that's what sort of got complicated in terms of like the, tech structure and offering. But coming back to your original question, the other thing to think about is just the macro environment. And if customers are already being more thoughtful about their purchases, and depending on the market that you're going to, they might be more conservative about new entrants, especially ones that they really don't understand the product for. Is that where you want to put your resources? Right. Or is there another place that will, to your point earlier of like product development and engagement with your existing retention offering, that might make more sense? Yeah. I would not say that internationalization and like the financial requirements of it always make sense for businesses.
So it's not there's not a clear sort of, hey, go, take on an investor who wants to help you scale, take that money, go put it into a new market. Sort of plug and play recipe there. It really depends specifically on the nature of the business and then how you're going into that market. What you're saying. Exactly. Unfortunately, there is no one size fits all playbook, which I think most businesses feel they wish there was. Maybe that's a good segue to sort of the third thing that we had talked about earlier, which is thinking about that strategy, right? That go-to-market strategy itself. So we've kind of said, okay, we feel like we've got an opportunity to go enter a new market. We believe that we can take a product there. I feel like I've got the right people on board at my company. We got everybody on the right seat in the bus, right? And we're ready to go, and everybody's expectations are aligned, and we've got the priorities set, the North Stars out there, and we're going to go and take this product and be successful. We're going to follow through on it. So now I guess the question is, what do we do, right? What's our strategy? How do we start to develop that go-to-market strategy for entering one of these new markets?
We've spoken about some of the early stages and we can sort of develop them, which is around like opening shipping to multiple markets and seeing where you get the most initial organic traction, starting to develop customer insights into those markets around both e-commerce and retail behaviors, if that's your genre, and or looking at, other significant players also from other markets who might be going into the same new market. So for example, at Away, there was a German brand who was also really saw the UK as a great opportunity. And suddenly in the US, where we really didn't have that kind of competition, in the UK, there was a secondary concern around competition.
Yeah. And they got to advertise that they were German engineered. So
exactly. And they were like their messaging was all about sustainability, which is a big watchword in that market, which in the States, frankly, we just aren't there yet. So having that like closer brand alignment on that end, it was like, okay, well, we need to really like up our game. And then you also have to start thinking about the nuts and bolts of like when and where do you become an entity? What is your tax implication structure? How does that impact your currency and pricing?
Mhm.
So from like an FP&A side of things, once you have multiple currencies, do you look at everything in dollars and have that currency exchange impact? Do you hold the exchange rate at the beginning of the year to the end, at least from a business growth perspective, and then simultaneously have to look at it month over month with actuals so that you know where your true cash position is? How does your system read multiple currencies? So, and the implications of each market might have different margin structures, depending on taxes and import duties, and even it's closer to go to Australia than it is to go to the UK from X market that it's being manufactured in.
Right.
So then you start to like build all of that out while you also think about the very traditional entry elements of where am I putting this product? How am I doing so? And how am I communicating to my potential customer? So you may in the States have opened a true like full D2C e-commerce only, no retail partner approach. That may not be the right approach in a new market. Maybe you actually want to leverage some incredible, validated, storied retailer to enter you into the market. And a lot of retailers actually, depending on the brand positioning in the home market, love that because it really helps them with their consumer. And it helps you with your credibility in a market that you're otherwise unknown.
Knowing the margins, I was reading about a product that basically in the US, you could do a full D2C simply because of the packaging. And so there would be a lot of breakage though in the European markets because of the restrictions on what you can use for packaging.
Interesting.
So because of that, you have the ability then to put, you say, okay, well, actually, we just need to ship, crates of this stuff to retailers and have them put it on a shelf, because I can't get this to someone's house because I'm not allowed to use the same kind of polypropylene, whatever foam that we just stuff everything in here and keep it safe. So cardboard's not going to cut it, right? So it's interesting as you think about going into the market, these things that you don't even consider because you're not even, it's not even on the radar in your successful US, go-to-market strategy. It's never come up once. Nobody's ever asked about it, right? Yeah. And all of a sudden you're like, well, we can't quadruple our spend on packaging. And all of a sudden that's cutting into the margin that we're making on these products, which are already probably pretty slim for a lot of things that you're selling, right? So,
and depending on how you structure your transportation and logistics system, you may need a 3PL in Europe. Does that also mean that you need a 3PL in the UK because of Brexit?
Yeah.
So you've actually not only increased your operations expenses and your people expenses by consequence, but also your inventory, because you have to hold inventory at all these different locations. Or do you split inventory and that becomes a whole different set of questions? But if you work with a retailer and you can deliver directly and you don't have to open the 3PL and you can have them be your drop ship or your e-commerce partner, would that make sense? You have less brand control. that is the main issue, and it eats into margin in a certain way as a wholesale account. But is that actually a great way to start and then pull into your brand own entities, either e-commerce, retail, or both?
Yeah. Well, this is maybe a good spot to make a shameless plug for Blue Onion, where I would say one of the big value propositions that we've seen is companies that operate in multiple markets from that kind of operational, the FP&A, the accounting perspective. Can I basically get that complete picture of how are we performing across different currencies and different markets with different strategies, different payment processors that you might have to implement in different countries. Same buy now, pay later that people like here might not be one that people can use in the UK or in the Netherlands, right? You got to spin up different payment processors. And that one of the really cool things that our software enables is actually this kind of unified view of your full financial stack, so that you're able to then turn around and very quickly turn out like, hey, okay, what's working, what's not working, what do we need to deprecate, how do we need to impact maybe the pricing or be spending on shipping, to be able to kind of get those numbers to work out, so that your entry is successful.
I wish I'd had that. It sounds so good.
And that's why we built it. As you know, Lindsay had you guys were being successful entering the Canadian market, and Lindsay, our CEO, was on the other side saying, we got to account for all this stuff. This is crazy. How do we do this, right?
Right. And even for her perspective, I mean, how people receive packages, and thinking about Birchbox specifically, it was this big of a product. And once upon a time, it could, in the UK, for example, they were like, do we make it slimmer so that it fits in the letterbox in the UK and doesn't get stolen? Because actually the delivery experience is different. Yeah.
Everybody's got little mail slots. They don't have
little mail slots.
Yeah.
But not every product fits in there. So
exactly. That's the kind of stuff that's a good point. That's a great one. Laura, I think maybe as we kind of conclude our time here, the question I want to ask you is, what happens if you fail? What happens if you go into a market and it just doesn't work out? How do you sort of think through the kind of debrief on that? How do you go about evaluating what worked and what didn't work? And then, what's the impact on your business? How do you kind of take the lessons learned from that and turn it around into success the next time?
Well, what I would imagine is that even before you get to that sort of end decision point, ideally you will have pivoted multiple times, learned along the way, and have all the record and sort of information that you've gathered over the years of learning. And I think there is probably a moment where you say, like, you know what, this business is either not something we can continue to invest in because we need to focus elsewhere, or we're really not seeing the product market fit that we would anticipate at this stage. Within a reasonable amount of time, we've invested in these ways. We're not just like, oh, this month didn't work. And at that point, you communicate very clearly to your consumers with enough lead time. You also hopefully can figure out from a legal perspective how you honor any commitments made around the product.
Yeah.
And exit. And there are different ways to do it. One would be like to actually just slowly wind down new inventory coming through. And so you just sell through and then you close. Another would be more abruptly to say, as of January 15th, we will no longer be operating, and understand if you want to ship that product back to the US or job it out or some other solution for the inventory. And then, do a lot of post work around, we've learned all these things over this time. What would have made it different? What are we going to take back into our core business? Or how are we going to use those learning in our core business? And it's not to say you can't try again. I mean, Sephora, for example, very recently went into the UK many, many, many years ago at this point, pulled out and have re-entered. And they're like, you know what? The competitive market has changed. The consumer has changed. Our operations and how we operate have changed. This is the time for Sephora in the UK. So it's never to say you can't go back. It's just, a phase, another phase, as long as you're able to sort of withstand the pressures of everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that is the name of the game, right? It's constantly be thinking about how can we go and do things better? How can we succeed where maybe we weren't as successful as we wanted to be the first time? And how can we build successful businesses that last a long time and that make a lot of consumers really, really happy? So, Laura, I am super grateful that you spent all this time sharing your insights with us. And I think that this is going to be one of the best times ever to enter new markets, because you know what? Where a lot of people are being really cautious and are really nervous is the time for people who are ready to be bold and take some risks, to go out there and stake their claim and grow a business and earn their share of the market. So I think that with that, it is probably worth sharing your contact information and saying, if you're thinking about a strategy, if you want to talk with someone who's had experience doing this before, that's what you do now, is talk with brands and help them come up with go-to-market strategies and growth strategies. So your contact information is here, and I think I'm free to say, just reach out to Laura and hit her up, LinkedIn, email, and strike up a conversation. And you're based in New York, right?
Yes, based in New York.
So I think you're probably free to also buy her a coffee or something like that if you are in the city. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to her. Team at Blue Onion, we've got a lot of folks who've got a ton of experience as well. You do not have to be a customer of ours to reach out and chat with us about what are we seeing. We work with over 350 brands at this point that are working in, I believe, all of the Commonwealth markets, as well as a few others. So there's a lot of stuff that we're seeing just in particular on the finance and accounting side that's really interesting. We have a ton of great accounting partners that we work with as well, that have a ton of experience helping brands set themselves up from an operational perspective for success in entering new markets. So kind of to a point you made earlier, Laura, I'll just reemphasize it. The best thing you can do is just network, talk with other people in the industry. It's obviously e-commerce is a super tight-knit community, and people are very willing to help each other out. And so anything that you want to just add there at the end, give you the last word?
There are lots of people willing to help, basically. So you're not alone in this process, and it's okay to explore and then decide it's not right, or it's okay to go forward and fully enter a new market, even when it feels risky.
Awesome. All right. Well, with that, we will say, see you later. Have a great rest of your day, and hope to hear from everyone who sees this. Hit us up anytime.